Our next guest is an award-winning journalist and currently a staff writer at The Atlantic covering national politics. Please welcome Adam Harris to the South by Southwest EDU studio. Hey, Adam.
How's it going?
So you're here at the South by Southwest EDU for a conversation with recent Prairie View A&M President Ruth Simmons. Can you give me some of the highlights?
Yeah. So we effectively talked about her career, right? She is the only person in American higher education to have served as both the president of an Ivy League institution as well as a historically black college. She brings to any conversation about higher education this sort of wealth of knowledge and experience and this sort of unique perspective on institutions and where they need to go. And so it's helpful in this moment of sort of tumult, right, when it comes to political involvement in higher ed, when it comes to diversity in higher education. She's able to bring a unique lens to what needs to happen to make higher education this sort of democratizing force that the founders envisioned it to be.
I mean, HBCUs have been chronically underfunded since their existence. You wrote a whole book about this. Can you explain how underfunding compounds and continues to this day?
Yes. So, thinking back to the fundamentals, right, the basis of our higher education system as we understand it today, it was never built on an idea of equality. Thinking about to the founding of historically black colleges, which are institutions founded primarily after the Civil War to serve students who have been shut out of the majority of higher education. From that initial federal grant, the 1890 Morrill Act, these institutions never necessarily received the same funding that predominantly white institutions did. And that legacy, right, when you think about where the institutions are, where the institutions could be had they received the same amount of funding as other institutions, is remarkable, especially considering that something around 50% of black lawyers and doctors, 80% of black judges, 25% of black STEM graduates, and 10% of black teachers still come from these institutions. A place like North Carolina A&T is the third highest research producing institution in the state of North Carolina, public institution in the state of North Carolina. And yet it continues to be underfunded. So where could these institutions be if they had not been underfunded?
So what do you think are some of the biggest misconceptions about HBCUs?
Yeah, it's always interesting because sometimes people will say that HBCUs are, exclusionary, right? That these are institutions. Why do we have institutions just for black students? But, they were actually some of the original institutions that provided opportunity for students of other races, right? They were created in part because, students were being shut out of certain colleges. I think that there's a misconception of HBCUs as sort of peripheral to higher education as opposed to sort of an integral part of what higher education is and what higher education is supposed to do. I mentioned the founder's vision for higher education. Of course, maybe it didn't include black students in that initial vision, but one of the things that George Washington said in his first address before Congress in 1790 was that higher education could be the place to build good citizens. They thought that America's colleges and universities were a place that students could learn and grow in a nation that had not fundamentally built out its own independent identity. And that was a place that they thought that learning the humanities, learning these higher ideals would be critical for students, and HBCUs have provided that.
I mean, they have had to do more with less. Could you talk about the outsized impact that they have in educating black professionals, as you said, lawyers, judges, doctors?
Yes, yeah, it's interesting the way that the institutions, even after integration, continue to provide that space for students to learn and to grow. There are places. We think about black doctors in this moment. A lot of black doctors tend to earn their bachelor's degree at a historically black college and then move on to medical school, right? They're still important institutions in part because of the way that they are able to cultivate identity and kinship among their student bodies. You think about the diversity within the diversity, right? If you're saying that a Black population is a majority on the campus, but it's not simply it's all Black people, so they all think alike, right? There's an ideological diversity. There is this rich texture to the campus community that I think helps lend itself to people being able to be themselves, to understand that they can realize their full selves at these institutions, and that just catapults them for the rest of their careers.
College is more than just an education.
Yes.
It's the connections. It's the social aspect that launches you for the rest of your career. I mean, how many people from college have connected you with jobs in the future?
Yes, exactly.
So college admissions studies show they've always been subjective, frequently biased against Black and brown students. Do you think a lottery system would be better? What sort of changes would you make?
Yeah, I think that a lot of changes will have to be made in the next couple of months to years, right? Thinking about some of the big cases that are coming before the Supreme Court. You have, they're currently deliberating on, the use of race in admissions. And of course, race can't be used as a factor to get somebody in as the sole factor that gets them in, only in concert with other factors. But I do think that, colleges should really think about the purpose of education, right? Is it to provide this great education to a small select amount of people, or are you trying to educate the masses, right? You think about access institutions, you think about public regional colleges who are doing the work of serving large swaths of the population. And I think until we reconfigure the way that we think about education, not as an individual good just for, you get this degree so that you can go on and get a job, but as a public good, right? Something that you are earning so that we have a more educated population writ large, so that it ultimately ends up being better for economic benefits that come alongside it, and some of the things that the founders were talking about, right? It's building good citizens through education and through some of those sort of humanizing principles that you learn while you're in college.
So that's very big picture. Do you think that, I know a lot of universities are talking about ditching the SAT and the ACT. What do you think? Do you think that that's actually going to eliminating those requirements will help?
We sort of had a test in test optional policies during the pandemic, right? A lot of institutions did temporarily get rid of the SAT and the ACT. Some of them have now turned that into a permanently getting rid of those tests. I tend to agree with those who argue that it's probably better for the institutions to be test optional, though there is still the concern that the people who can afford to pay for a lot of test prep, who are able to get those really good scores, they can still submit them, and the university may say, oh, well, this person has submitted a perfect score on their SAT, or they submitted a very high score on their ACT. So I don't think that it's a perfect solve for the admissions woes that we see, but I also do think that it is a little bit more democratizing to at least have it be test optional. I think that is a good path forward for higher ed.
Now, I just don't think you can test for gumption or follow through or perseverance.
Yeah, the sort of the grit things are difficult to test for, but I also think that's where those other factors of the application come in, right? Thinking about the student's essay, thinking about their extracurriculars and their personal life and different things like that are really helpful. And that's one of the things that admissions processes have tried to explain to the Supreme Court, tried to explain elsewhere. Right? This is a holistic admissions process where they're looking at the whole student and what they would contribute to the campus community. I also think the way that people understand admissions can get a little bit mixed up sometimes, because it is when you think about colleges often talk about crafting a class, right? Yeah. They're trying to get a different mix of students so that when they bring them together, people are learning from each other and learning from their differences. So that crafting a class is actually a really important thing to keep in mind.
So do you have any thoughts on the upcoming Supreme Court rulings about affirmative action? I know that's quite a big question, but what do you think the impact will be?
You know, I think that institutions, when they are not able, we've seen what happens when institutions are not able to consider race in admissions, right? In California, we saw a precipitous drop in Black and Latino enrollment in their, most selective institutions. In Michigan, you saw a similar drop when they eliminated affirmative action. So we already know what happens when institutions are no longer allowed to use race in admissions, and there are not really good proxies for race in admissions, right? You can use socioeconomic status, but it's just a fact that there are more poor white people in America than there are poor people of any other race, right? And so if you consider the sheer numbers, then it won't provide the same results, right? And so I do worry about what will happen if, the use of race in admissions is eliminated. But we also do have to remember that it is only a small band of schools that are selective enough to need to use race in admissions. And I think one of the things that this will do is emphasize the role of institutions such as Hispanic serving institutions, Asian American, Native American, Pacific Islander serving institutions, places, public regional colleges, rural colleges, places that are serving students as more access institutions rather than selective, and funding those institutions for the important roles that they provide.
All right, so what was your analysis of the backlash surrounding the Biden administration's initial efforts towards debt forgiveness? What do you think the future of debt forgiveness could be?
The backlash is in a lot of ways to be expected, right? In part because of how we view higher education. You view it as a private good. You view it as something that is only for this individual. Thinking back to these popular conceptions of college, thinking back to the founders, thinking back to 1862 with the Morrill Act, thinking about the GI Bill, these were all things to increase the educated masses in our population. But I also, you think about the debt that students are in now. Oftentimes, folks are saying, well, I was able to pay my way through college, so why shouldn't they? And well, it's a little bit different when your tuition was $2,500 a semester, as opposed to $2,500 a credit hour or $2,500 for 3 credit hours. That's a very different proposition. And so students are having to pull on these resources that were effectively supposed to be a tool, to help you pay for college rather than the key to paying for college. I think so the backlash was to be expected, but I think that there's just still this broad misconception about what higher education is supposed to be. Is it supposed to be a private good, or is it something that is good for the good of all Americans?
Well, since socioeconomically the underrepresented are more affected by the debt.
Yes. Yeah.
That seems to be like the debt forgiveness is definitely going to be for people who have less of a chance to pay it back. So do you think the backlash could have anything to do with that?
Yeah, I do think so. I think that oftentimes, people have used as a sort of scapegoat, right? Well, I don't want to be paying for doctors who went to med school. I don't want to be paying for lawyers who went to law school. I want to pay their bills. But effectively, the majority of what and the way that the debt forgiveness was targeted was to affect those sort of lower income folks, which, maybe teachers, maybe social workers, maybe folks who got some college and no degree, right? So they're not reaping the benefits, the financial benefits of a college degree. And I think it's important that we remember that that's the population that would be served by debt forgiveness. Because when we do kind of widen it out and say, oh, well, it's all these doctors and lawyers who are going to get it, I think that misstates the actual problem. And as you were mentioning, right, the people who hold debt, when you think about African Americans, right, Black people are more likely to take on student debt, they're more likely to take on more student debt, and they're more likely to default on those loans afterwards, in part because of the way that higher education is set up, so that students who attend institutions that are able to assist them financially with grants, or are able to do tuition free because they have the endowments. It's a little bit different than an HBCU that doesn't have that really big tuition that it can draw on to provide that wide array of scholarships to students.
So you got kids.
I do.
What will be your advice to them about college?
I think my advice to my kids about college will be similar to my parents, which was effectively, and this may be naive of me, and I may, they're 5 and 3 right now, so I may change my mind in 13 years. But my parents effectively told me, do what makes you happy. They knew, because both of them are HBCU graduates. My mom graduated from Oakwood. My dad graduated from Alabama State. They knew that it doesn't necessarily matter where you go to college. What matters is what you do while you're there, what you do after you leave college. That is ultimately the most important thing. And they never really made my college decision a stressor. To say that, oh, well, you need to go to this Ivy League institution, or you need to go to another institution. So I don't think I would be one to pressure them too much, in part because of the way that I wasn't pressured.
Well, if it makes you feel better, study after study has showed that the college you go to is not a predictor of success or happiness.
Yes.
You could go to an Ivy League college and still wind up doing something that's, not high level. So.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you turned out great, so your kids will be fine.
I think things worked out all right.
How do you see the role of higher education evolving in the next decade, especially as they become even more unaffordable to families?
I have 2 answers to that. One of them is my hopeful answer, and that is that people will recognize higher education as a public good, that lawmakers will fund higher education in a way that is responsive to that mission, to that public mission. But I do worry, especially with the way that things have been going on a national scale, and the sort of demonization of higher education as an institution. I do worry that we will continue to see the trends that we've seen for the last several years, right? Lawmakers, when they look for places to cut in a budget, one of the first places they look is higher education. And that just means that more of the cost of college will fall back onto those families. So I do think that there needs to be a fundamental rethinking of the way that college is paid for. I don't think that relying on loans will be sustainable, or it's proven not to be sustainable, but I think that will only get more unsustainable. But if there is, as we've seen, glimpses of a reinvestment in higher education, I do think that, in the same way that the founders thought, right, it could be a way to bring people together.
I got to say, I always like that pay it forward idea that you can decrease your student debt if you are a teacher for a couple years. Yeah. Just saying, I would advocate for that. Yeah. But let's get back to this. You are working on a new book about Southern politics. Yes. Can you give us a little sense of what you're working on?
Yes. So the book is a narrative history of America as a Southern nation, fundamentally guided by the South and its politics since 1812, when Louisiana was admitted to the Union and gave the South half of the votes in the Senate, and traces the several iterations of new Souths, new political Souths up until now, to show the ways that the South has changed the nation, and the way that and to effectively examine the progressive energy around a new South at this moment.
So nice, light topic. Not hard at all.
Yeah, nothing heavy.
Well, you've got a keen reporter's eye, so I'm sure it'll be amazing. While you're here, what are some of the storylines at the EDU that have interested you?
I am really interested in ChatGPT and AI. I think that, thinking about argumentative essays and how fundamental they were to language arts and English education is actually really fascinating to me. I'm also interested in the way that, even if it's not writing someone's college essay for them, it's sort of seeding them ideas for an essay. And ways that institutions should look at that positively, and ways that they should also look at it and say, okay, well, maybe we should figure out ways to address this before it becomes a problem. So I think that's one of the things that I'm most interested in. But I'm also, of course, the biggest storyline that I've been following for the last several years has been the admissions decision at the Supreme Court. And am really interested to see what colleges will do in an environment, especially the highly selective colleges, to see what they'll do in an environment where they can no longer use race in admissions.
Well, you'll have to check out some of our other interviews because everybody's talking about AI. All right. Adam, thanks for being here today, and thank you all for watching. You can check out our daily schedule of interviews on our website, schedule.sxswedu.com. You can watch all of the studio interviews on the South by Southwest EDU TV app and on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/@South by Southwest EDU. I'm Kari Byron. Thank you for watching.